Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this session on operationalizing technical privacy reviews. I'm Hernando Buitrago, head of marketing at Privado, and I'm here with Nishant Bajaria, who will be today's moderator. He, as you may all know, he's a leading expert in the field of data privacy. He's author of the book, Data Privacy, a Runbook for Engineers. He's accompanied by a panel of experts, including Alejo Grigera Sutro, his senior staff privacy engineer at 1Password, Mira Olson, privacy architect at DoorDash, and Alon Levy, engineering manager at Uber. Before we start, I do want to let you know that Privado is the host, sponsor of this presentation, and Privado enables you to build privacy into products at scale by giving you complete visibility of data, lifecycle, programmatic privacy governance, and seamless developer collaboration. Additionally, we have a privacy engineering Slack group that you're welcome to join. We will actually be hosting an AMA with Nishant that will happen next Friday, and that's exclusively for people in the Slack group. So please do join that. And yes, we'll post a link for that for joining the community here. But with that, Nishant, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Hernando. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Alejo, Mira, Alon. It's always nice to meet old friends and new friends all over again and educate people on privacy engineering. As Hernando alluded to, I am an advisor to Privado and an author of the book Data Privacy, Runbook for Engineers. This webinar is part of a long-term effort for us to build a privacy security engineering community, create awareness, give everybody hands-on actionable tools to take back to their jobs, and furthermore, just make sure that we are there for each other to support each other because it's a hard field to get into. It's an even harder field to succeed in. So super happy that all of you chose to spend some time with us this Thursday afternoon actually still the morning on the East Coast. I'm actually working out in New York this morning. So I'll let my panelists introduce themselves a little bit about their transition to privacy and then move into privacy review. So Mira, you want to go first?
Absolutely. Yes, I am a privacy architect. I was working with Nishant previously at Uber for a handful of years as a privacy architect there, deep in the world of technical privacy reviews, and recently moved over to DoorDash, where I'm leading data strategy, everything from data governance to hopefully building a nice technical privacy review process as well in the coming future. So glad to be here, Nishant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. Aleo, you want to go next?
Certainly. Let's see. I started my privacy journey way back in, I think, 2009-ish, back at Google, where I started working in a privacy team in infrastructure. And from there, kind of helped grow it out, starting building these privacy teams very early on. And then eventually worked at Lyft for a couple of years, helping to grow their privacy team, both in some technical sense as well as a sort of an analytical sense. And then that eventually led me to 1Password, where today we're helping to bootstrap a new privacy team.
Thank you, Leo. Alon?
Hey, thanks, Nishant. Really happy to be here. So I have about 12 years of engineering experience from places like Microsoft and Uber. I've worked with Nishant previously at Uber as well. And over the last few years, I've mainly been either building or leading teams that build privacy platforms and tooling. Thanks, Nishant.
Awesome. Thank you, Alon. It's kind of nice. I'm sure there's somebody out there smirking. We have Uber, DoorDash on the call at the same time, and somebody with Lyft experience as well. So I guess if we had somebody from Ola Cabs, we'd have that circle around it too, but it's always nice to have something for next time. So before we go into sort of a ton of detail, I want to understand what privacy reviews actually mean. Privacy reviews mean different things for different people. If we have attorneys on the call, they think of privacy reviews typically through the lens of the PIA, that is the Privacy Impact Assessment, or the DPI, that is the Data Protection Impact Assessment, where we have three technologists on the call here and me, because the three people on the tech side are much smarter than I am. So I would love to understand your perspectives as what does the phrase privacy review mean? And this time I'll go with Alejo first. What does it mean to you?
Sure. So a privacy review for me has always meant going in and validating a lot of the questions and answers that we see in those privacy impact assessments. We're sort of like another pair of eyes, looking over legal's shoulder as we're seeing these things go by and saying, well, hang on a second, does this make sense? And looking with that technical lens. So a lot of times we'll see, for example, two answers in different parts of these PIAs, and using our technical background, we might say, wait a second, these two answers seem incongruous. These things can't be true at the same time. Or wait a second, based on my knowledge of the way our products work, the way our features work, or the way the infrastructure or technologies work, these things can't hold. And so we're able to go and dig in further and say, hang on, help me understand this. Or wait, we need a protective technology here to make sure that these things can hold and to make sure that we're protecting users. So I can talk more about it later in the panel, but for example, that's one of the things that it means to me.
That was great. Thank you, Alejo. Mira, you want next?
Yeah, for me, the tech privacy review specifically is the sort of in-between land between legal and engineering. Often we think of, like you said, Nishant, most people think of the privacy review from that PIA perspective. So really just looking high level, what data is in scope, why is it being collected? And oftentimes in engineering requirements doc, engineers will include high-level answers to those questions, but it takes the technical privacy review to really dig down into the system design to understand the architecture, understand the data flows, to see if in fact at collection, at storage, at data sharing processes, and all of the parts of the data lifecycle, if in fact we're treating the data as we say we are and are being privacy friendly in doing so.
Awesome. So, and there's a segue to the next question, but I want to hold off before I want to hold off on that and before I reach out to Alon. So Alon, you want to talk about what the word privacy review means to you?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like mainly from the engineering perspective, it gives engineers the opportunity to interact with real privacy technologists and professionals and boost the confidence that the design meets the requirements of user data handling and additional privacy compliance. Essentially, I feel like it should be seen as a aid to the general engineering population to make sure we're doing the right things.
This was great. And I love the fact that all three of you come at it with the perspective of helping the engineers do it right. Because at the end of the day, and I've said this before in other podcasts as well, privacy is a great field to be in. It's a great problem to solve, but it's not a cause to fight with people over. Like if you tell the engineers in your company that they don't care about privacy, that somehow you have the more higher moral ground, it's a great speech to give. But unfortunately, that soapbox is going to get pretty lonely pretty quickly because without the business, there is nobody to pay for privacy salaries, right? So you have to balance the business's needs with the needs of the customer. And there's a way to get privacy done correctly without hurting the business, 95% of the time at least. And just save the battles for that 5%. So I love the fact that there's a collaborative instinct here. But how do you address it through the lens of the concern, which I often heard at my previous jobs, which is if you add the technical privacy review process, it creates more bureaucracy. The engineers have to go through security reviews, the DPI, the PIA, and now you're adding one more review to the process. How do you do that without creating more entropy and more delay? So can you share how you've dealt with that skepticism, how you've navigated that, or how you wish people to think about it? So this time I'm going to go with Alejo first.
Sure. That's a great question. In my history, as much as possible, I have tried to find sort of wavelengths that are already in place and tried to harmonize with those business processes that already exist and try to find ways that we can insert ourselves into those. And again, it doesn't just mean, existing sort of review processes. It could be anything. So I can give you some very specific examples. So these could be those existing PIAs. If you come into a scenario and they already exist, great. Let's see if we can augment those to include that technical privacy review component. We're already asking these questions. How can we tweak them to also get what we need as technical privacy reviewers? But again, we can go beyond that. We can say things like, oh, there's already security training. Great. Can we get technical privacy components in there to make this also a privacy training? Oh, there's already these code review components in the software development lifecycle. Can we also get technical privacy review components in there to make this part of what we need as part of our review lifecycle? So that's kind of how I look for it. We don't want as much as possible to be a new, unique piece of bureaucracy. We want to coexist in a greater ecosystem so that we kind of blend into that fabric.
I love the fact that, I love the optimism here that you can blend in because honestly, like the idea of adding more bureaucracy just scares me. As an engineer back in the day, I was the guy that typically pushed back against bureaucracy. So I understand the feeling, but it often, you lose empathy as time goes by. So with that note, Mira, you want to shed some light on how do you deal with the pressure that privacy reviews add entropy and add thrash to the process?
Absolutely. To what you were saying earlier is if we can approach it from the we are helping engineers versus we are a blocker, that framing is really important. And that requires embedding yourself with the eng team, with the eng planning cycles, and partnering with the engineering teams, really making friends and colleagues of these individuals rather than being an adversary. I think also education, the more that we can educate our teams through technical privacy trainings, Alejo, as you were saying, leveraging existing trainings, but then building on that, having tech privacy trainings and having privacy champs within orgs, so that having those existing human connections, there's less of an aversion to adopt a technical privacy review. And again, Alejo, what you were saying, leveraging existing systems. In the past, we've built off of existing ERD review processes. So having a quick check. If there's personal data in scope, it goes into a triage process. And if not, you're free and clear to go. So there are ways to automate this so that it's not just another blocker.
And by the way, Mira, just to be clear, when you say ERD, you mean the Eng requirements document, correct?
Yes.
Just in case other companies have their own acronyms, so just being a little careful here. Awesome. Alon, what do you want to add to this process, this conversation here?
Honestly, I entirely agree with both the points Alejo and Mira made. When engineers go into this process, it's going to be with a level of trepidations, mainly about what type of guidance is going to be provided, how much overhead is it going to be to implement the guidance that was provided, and then is this going to delay my feature? Is this going to block me from shipping? And those are the type of things that basically we need to flip the switch on. Instead of, I think the technical privacy program, instead of just coming up with gaps, also needs to couple that by providing what would be the solution for the situation. So for example, if in the review, it was identified that certain retention policies need to be applied to the data, instead of just shuffling that off to the engineering teams and telling them, all right, go ahead and implement that, we need to basically be able to provide them a solution out of the gate. Please make sure that you label your data correctly, and then our platform is just going to handle that for you. And that's how hopefully it could be seen more as kind of an allyship to empower them rather than a blocker for their development.
Love the practical example, Alon, which is give people actual solutions. I would go a step further, Alon, and say that maybe when you identify these gaps in a team's spec and design, and you give them actual solutions, it creates the opportunity for the next product that you could build or the next training you could do. So in essence, I would say for the people on the panel and the people in the audience, think of every ERD review, maybe not every single one, but the major ones, as a way to sort of create your roadmap. There is a straight roadmap between the gaps you see in the organization via the ERD review process on the one side, and the roadmap for a privacy eng team, which is if one team is making the mistake of using a policy incorrectly, there's a pretty good chance that 15 other teams are as well. So building something out for many, many people based on the learnings of one person could be very helpful. And it goes back to the point Mira made, which is how do you come off as being a helper? How do you come off as not being a blocker? Because remember, we live in this age of efficiency. So how do you make sure that you make the first hit expensive? When you talk about data caching, the first hit is expensive, and then every subsequent hit becomes really cheap until the cache has to be refreshed, right? It's the same logic from ERD review process, which is you make the first review a bit expensive only for that team, but with the goal that getting it right for that team means the 50 other teams behind that team will get it right, right? That's kind of the way to think about this, practically speaking. We have a question from Michelle, but I want to ask one more question before I jump into Michelle's questions. And by the way, people in the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A section. So happy to answer them as we go along. One of my friends at a company in the Bay Area launched a privacy review process, a tech privacy review process back in 2019. And they made the mistake of not actually getting legal buy-in before announcing it because they thought it's a technical privacy review process. The legal team may not care too much. Why not just announce it? The legal team was really pissed off and they said, this is going to add entropy, it's going to add trash. So in the previous question, all of you gave me insights about how do you position the review for your customers, which is the engineers whose ERDs they are. If the legal team were to push back and say this is not necessary or it's going to add extra delays, how do you bring the legal team on board? Because let me stipulate at the outset, a tech privacy review process that does not have the legal team's buy-in ain't going nowhere fast. So how do you bring the legal team along? This time I'll go with Mira first.
In my experience, I always come back to diplomacy. I mean, and that we'll blame that on my past in DC working in government work, but I think that human connection is very important. Having regular meetings with the legal team and being able to explain to the legal team. I think that's the crucial part of a technical privacy specialist, is being able to communicate to the legal team. Look, I'm identifying these gaps in our systems. Can we build legal requirements to then drive end roadmap? And or this is the reason, in the PIA, you've indicated that this isn't possible, but if we approach it by this other technical solution, we can actually find a way to enable the business. So I think there's a way to, you've talked about this in the past as being like a translator. And I think that's the key role here, is if you can be that translator for legal, then it's facilitating a conversation, and you're continuing to enable the business rather. And that's what we're all here to do.
Alon, your turn.
Yeah, honestly, everything Mira said is really spot on. Generally, engineers honestly just don't understand the legalese. There needs to be some sort of translation process to be able to provide an actual actionable technical advice, to be able to adapt the design or an actual solution. So to me, it just seems natural that this additional step in this process is just so crucial to actually get results. And yeah, I think that's my main point to add here.
So just before I go to Alejo, just a quick tip off to the audience here. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab. The chat tab is not for questions, so I won't be looking at it as frequently. So please put your questions in the Q&A section, okay? One takeaway I'll give before, actually, let me go to Alejo first. Alejo, you want to jump in first? How do you bring the legal team on board?
Oh gosh, no, what a scenario. That's so hurtful. That would break my heart. It would. Like if I had found out that had happened on my team, and I would probably spring to action and immediately start booking meetings and trying to repair the relationship. Because and I don't know, maybe especially because we're being recorded, I might be burned at the stake for saying this, but that might be like the most important inter-team relationship, I think, that exists between a technical privacy team, like my privacy engineering team, and like the next team is going to be privacy legal. So that's a bridge you can't afford to have any damage to. So bringing them on board, like I said earlier, a lot of it is around making sure that your operations are in tight lockstep. And when I think about what would happen in that specific scenario, a lot of it is going to be the kind of dispersion that can happen when you're not in lockstep. It's that you're going to start to see gaps arise. What does legal see that we don't, right? Legal has access to things like what contracts are being signed that maybe don't have as much of a technical overlap that you might see, what's being launched, what features are going out the door that legal can't see. And if you're not in lockstep, they're not going to see those changes that have a material change to how we're treating data as an organization. That, right, they're not going to have that purview, and you're not going to see what's going on in those contract signings. And that's just not healthy. So again, you want those things to be really tightly coupled together so you have the same pool of oversight. So I'd absolutely be wanting to bring the humans together, the people together, and say, okay, no, let's start rebuilding this relationship. We have to have our operations tightly coupled so we're all seeing the same things. We don't all have to be in every single review with the same level of attention. That's okay. That's good. That's just good process engineering, making sure we've got the right people looking at the right things. But we all want to have the same pipe coming in the door with good triage thereafter. That's kind of how I'd start working on that, but I'd start with the people.
Okay, my insight to this, and I don't think I can improve on all that's been already said, but let me just add a particular insight here. Typically in a company, if you look at the Eng PM ratio, it's about 8-1. You have 1 PM for 8 managers writing code. The legal team ratio is even more lopsided. It might be 30 or 40-1. So my push to the legal team would be, why do you want to own all the risk? You guys don't have the ability to influence the cloud provider. You don't have the ability to influence the tech stack. All those decisions typically get made not even at the director or the VP level, but they get made by the IC 5, 6, and 7s who genuinely are the ones writing code. So why would you want very little of the autonomy, but all the responsibility? So why not work together to build out a structure? So giving the legal team visibility, I'm not suggesting that this is a sales job at all, although every job is a bit of a sales job. What I am suggesting though is tell the legal team where they're getting a raw deal, because people often don't realize where they don't have the right thing going for them. So if you tell the legal team that if I'm making the argument, I'm saying, I used to be an engineer. I know where the bodies are buried because I put some of them there myself. I have made these mistakes, but I made those mistakes at a time when there wasn't a whole lot of visibility and scrutiny. Today's engineers are making mistakes at a faster clip with cloud computing, Gen AI level of processing, mobile data, continuous computing. So the scale of those mistakes is much, much higher. I remember back in my undergrad days in the early aughts when I was an RA in college, one of my fellow RAs, a resident assistant, somebody who sort of works as a counselor to fellow students in the dorm, he brought in a beer bottle in the dorm. We weren't supposed to have beer inside the dorms. And one of his friends took a picture and posted it on a GeoCities page. If people remember what GeoCities used to be back in the day, I'm dating myself a little bit. And that picture was reviewed at the sort of this meeting a couple of weeks after or something, and he lost his job. And that was a pretty big deal back then because all he done is had a bottle of beer in his hands. It was not a loaded bottle at all. He was just holding it for reasons that pass understanding. The question is, if that were to happen today, he might have lost his job, but just as easily it might have been forgotten because there would have been some much bigger scandal happening elsewhere. So it's become very hard to predict and manage things as they happen today in this age of fast dissemination. So why would a legal team depend upon a manual review process and take on all the risks? So why not amend that review process so that you can have technical privacy architects and engineers conduct some preemptive reviews on a shift left basis at the beginning of the process, up-level the risks, identify patterns, and then bring to the legal team the most critical ERDs that need to be reviewed. So I think that's how I would position it. I would explain the larger macroeconomic, technical, social context, place the PIA in that context, place a tech privacy review in that context, and then shape the ownership process. That's how I would do it, because I kind of feel like you have to explain things to people. Like you have to tell people stories, because unless data will tell people the outcomes and the questions, but stories tell people what they need to hear first, right? Like you win people's minds with facts, you win people's hearts with stories, right? So think about that through that lens and tell the story. But it takes a bit of experience, takes a bit of patience. And so hopefully the four of us have given perspectives to the panel to the audience to sort of go run with. With that being said, I'm going to take an audience question. And maybe we don't know the answer to this one, but I'll just put it out anyways. Michelle asks, would be great to get panel views on the new ISO 31700 on privacy by design, where they're thinking about privacy by design from an engineering perspective. Even if the three of you don't know the ISO 31700 standard, let's talk about privacy by design through an eng perspective. So what do you want to talk about there? Alejo, you want to go first?
Sure. Privacy by design, I've found it to be a useful touchstone in many ways, especially when you're dealing with like the broader population. I think within the organization, it covers the privacy context really well. I think it just covers a little bit of everything. I've liked to use it particularly in like a training context. It's really good for saying, all right, really quick, this is nice off the shelf pop-in collection of material. When it comes to actually applying it in an engineering context, I struggle a little bit with regards to actually converting it into tactical guidance, but I have found it very useful in saying, hey, look, in this particular situation, right, here's what you've done, right? Here's what happened in this particular product. Here's the feature that you've built, and here's my issue with the way that you've built this particular feature, right? It violates this privacy by design concept, right? And we've talked about this. It's in the training. This has been around for years. You should know this by now. This isn't a hard concept, right? Look, this is your default, right? You can do better, right? And so it acts as a really good framework for maybe contextualizing and structuring your response to that particular issue. Does that make sense? So it's a very good framework, but I can't say I've used it particularly as like a go-to wellspring of answers. Does that make sense? So it's a good way of structuring answers, not a good place to go for answers. It would be my response.
Alon, you want to go next?
Yeah, I might have the least experience on the panel of actually trying to apply these principles of wider engineering organization. But mostly as a consumer, or as a partner in some of these discussions, I think probably the most important thing is to try and kind of embed these things as early as possible within the life cycle, just so these aren't things that spring up on engineers at the very tail end of building things. I think that's probably the way to make it as successful as possible within that process. Easier said than done, might not be the most insightful, but definitely I think probably my most important takeaway.
Awesome. So before I chime in, Mira, you want to finish this thought here?
Sure. Alejo, I agree with you in terms of operationalizing the privacy by design principles isn't always easy, especially if it's coming late in the review process. At that point, it's just a checklist of what's missing. But where it is really useful is when the technical privacy specialist can really work with the engineers in the ideation phase before even getting things into code, into design, even just really thinking about from the ideation standpoint, okay, looking at the principles. That's when privacy by design, I think, is most applicable or most easily applied, because then we're thinking through that lens as we ideate and then coming into design and build.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point. So it goes back to the shift left approach. People keep saying shift left, and I give Vaibhav, the CEO of Privado, and I have often talked about this. Code scanning is one way to do that, because you can make privacy about design, you can make privacy about data, but privacy really begins with the code as well, because that is where people make a million small decisions with every line of code, every API call, every database, every piece of data that gets logged, right? So it's part of the shift left approach. How do you make sure that you introduce technology to address privacy problems as quickly as possible, embedding privacy controls into the code, checking the code before the data grows in volume? That's pretty critical. Let me move on to the next question. We have a lot of questions coming in here. In the absence of privacy engineers, how can a company leverage on their non-technical privacy professionals to support developers to integrate privacy in the SDLC? So how do you make sure that the design and lifecycle process for software has privacy embedded into it when you don't have an explicit privacy engineering champion in the company at that moment? I want to go to Alon first.
I'll be honest, I think that might be quite the challenge. I think in the absence of a privacy engineering champion or a privacy champion, it's kind of a role that somebody needs to take on organically. I feel it's difficult to both enforce and instill without somebody basically being the mantle holder and pushing for it. So maybe not the best answer.
No, I mean,
But
and honestly, there are going to be people on the audience who don't know either. So and for them, this is clarifying. And I love Alon for his humility and his honesty, because just because we are on the panel doesn't mean we have all the answers. So for those of you in the audience to recognize that the answers may lie with you sometimes is a good thing. And that's what this community is about. So appreciate the candor, Alon. Mira, you want to jump in and see what you have to say about this topic?
Yeah, I think where resourcing is limited, where there aren't, or smaller organizations that just don't have a dedicated privacy engineering team, it becomes really important for privacy to be built into both the security trainings and even like a legal compliance training that everybody receives. And then that there's a deeper dive for engineers in their Eng boot camps that takes that basic privacy training to the more granular, more technical level, so that they're at least learning the fundamentals of privacy from day one. And then if there's no privacy engineering team, that the privacy legal org would then work with the Eng org to have a dedicated engineer on each team to be a privacy champ to help with oversight during the planning phases, yeah.
Okay. And before I go to Alejo, I'll basically just mention, typically the case for privacy engineering is always first made without the privacy engineers being there, because it's either a breach or some kind of privacy harm or some assessment that falls flat or some big fine that gets levied upon a company or its competitor that creates the urgency. Human beings don't respond to morality as much as they represent to urgency. So I don't think the situation posited by the question is as distinct as people may think it is. And I remember when I was at Nike back in the day, I had a boss who was very, very forward thinking, but that was a rare situation, at least 10 years ago, when we were looking at migrating our data to the cloud, onboarding Big ID at the same time. So for people in the audience who are afraid of not having a champion, please don't be afraid, you'll get there. So, but before I provide you my perspective, I want to go to Alejo first. Alejo, you want to go next?
Oh, I was dreading this one. This is a anonymous attendee. You're asking the tough questions. If this came up, I was typing furiously, just trying to think up a couple answers to this one. Just good tactical response for this one. These are three things that I think I would say you could try, that I've seen work in the past if you didn't have technical privacy professionals. The first would be searching, and I think Alon talked about this a little bit, was looking for champions within your organization. Just because you don't have a technical privacy reviewer or privacy engineer doesn't mean nobody cares about privacy and is an engineer. So you can find people around the organization who know their engineering scope and environment who also care about privacy, and you can kind of like deputize them a little bit and sort of reach out to them when you have questions or when you see something that seems amiss and rope them in, and they might be willing to kind of donate some time and help. Don't sort of underappreciate that tactic. It works. And you can find other ways to sort of reward that behavior and recognize it. And sort of as a bit of a bureaucrat, you can also sort of send that sort of positive energy and recognition their way. And that is valuable. You have that power. The second thing I would say is you can ask more questions, even not as a technical person, just as a lay, a non-technical person, you can still ask and say, why does this work this way? Why does it have to be this way? This doesn't feel right, or it doesn't match these privacy by design principles. And even as a non-technical person, don't accept their answer. You can keep asking why, and dig. And if you can see them squirm or see them tie themselves up in knots, or it doesn't seem to align, something might not be right. And look for other answers and look for where things just don't line up. And you can look for those and say, okay, hang on, right? Maybe it doesn't need to be this way. In a sense, and I hate to put it this way, but you'll find where people start to negotiate against themselves. Sorry, I hate to make it nasty, but it's a tactic and it works. And then finally, and I promise I'll stop talking here just a second, Nishant, I promise. The last one is look up and look over, right? Look at other companies that are doing something similar to this feature or this product that's about to launch and say, why can't we do it like that? They're getting privacy, right? Why can't we? Or this is a similar feature that's happening. Why can't we do it with that privacy feature or like this tactic? And that doesn't require that technical insight. You can look at those results and say, I want those results, or why can't we have those results? So those are three very specific tactics that I've seen work and that I think you can try that don't require that technical skill set. Back to you, Nishant.
Thank you. I can't improve upon that very much, but I'll offer another idea as well. Problems tend to come in twos and threes and not ones historically. So if you are seeing a privacy problem someplace in your company, I can guarantee you other people are making the same mistake in the company as well. Or other people who are not making the mistake are getting impacted by it too. So if you see over data collection happening, there's a good chance that there's somebody in the platform team having to transpose the data from point A to point B, lift and shift. Or there's going to be somebody in the warehouse who's having to restate their clusters. Or somebody in the AI team who's getting bad data quality. Identify allies from the business who don't necessarily understand privacy, but who are impacted by bad privacy practices. So if you can build those bridges in that sense, that's how you can create allies. Because historically, over the last 5 years, every time, even after writing a book in my career, I have had more success making the case for privacy when my mouth was shut, which is something my wife says I should do more often. But it's basically somebody else making the case for me. And there have been examples in my career where I have made the argument by just stepping back and letting the business basically say, let's do X instead of Y. And historically, that's a way for me to influence the business. People use the phrase influence without authority. That's one example of that. It's like my debate coach in college used to say, you win debates not by doing well in front of your own coach during the practice session. You win debates by doing well in front of the other person's coach when the lights are on. So sometimes stepping back and letting somebody else do the talking can be very helpful. And with that being said, I'll move on to the next question. My good friend Heather Fetterman asks, how about, sorry, actually, there's one more question before then. What do you do when there is no C-suite support? So we just talked about not having enough eng support. What does not having C-suite support look like, and how do you navigate that? Mira, you want to go first?
A little bit to what you were speaking of, Nishant, of kind of leveraging the business use cases, leveraging places where we've identified that privacy is a gap and is actually a risk to the business, collecting those use cases, and then showing the business, here's the risk that we're facing by not implementing these changes, and to the flip side, here's the reward. And oftentimes that means monetizing that risk, the risk of fines in X amount versus it's going to cost us a couple engineers over 6 months to build X, Y, or Z tool. So I think for the business, it's often that case. And then once we get that higher level buy-in, it sort of unlocks the floodgates.
Awesome. Leo, you want to go for next?
Yeah, I did a lot of talking on the last one, so I'm going to cut it short on this one. I think Mira's dead accurate, and Nishant said it earlier. Every job is a little bit of sales, and I think this is one of those cases. You need to find out what those C-suite executives care about and help connect what you're seeing to what they're seeing. Back to you.
Alon?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with both of the things that were just said, but I'd probably also couple it with taking an engineering data-driven approach. And you've mentioned some of the bodies that are buried that we know about, basically surfing some of those and coupling those with the monetary risks that's associated to, I think the case kind of makes itself once you present it that way.
That's a great point. And I would say to the audience that if there is one thing business hates, it's uncertainty. So with privacy, what you do is you take uncertainty, you use your judgment, data, and instinct and trends and your relationships across the business and convert that uncertainty into quantifiable risk. And then you make the case that privacy is a product like anything else. It's a feature. You do not buy a car without seat belts. You do not buy a house without an inspection. You don't eat food without first looking at the Yelp reviews, right? Or Uber reviews, whatever you're calling about. So you do your due diligence before you spend 50 bucks on something. Why would you not do your due diligence before you ship something, right? How would it look if you shipped something and then you had to roll it back after putting it on somebody's cell phones, right? So how do you create a sense of predictability? And this is where the business at the C level and the engineers at the IC level collude together. The business needs stuff to ship on time to make predictable revenue. The ICs need stuff to ship on time to get their promos and their stock grants. You got to find a way to combine people's interests and shape them into one whole. And being able to do that is the easy way to make the case. I'm not saying it's easier, but it's easier rather. So try and find examples where risk creates uncertainty creates bad outcomes for everybody concerned. So that'd be one way to go. The next question is from Sabrin. Would be great to discuss ideas on how to garner support for resources to staff the privacy review process in this tight budget situation that we're in right now. So how would you make the case for budget? You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, when you guys figure this one out, let me know. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, no, this is the perennial problem. And I think especially just, these days, the job only gets harder. I think in this one, I can really only speak in abstractions because this is really going to depend on your local situation, the size of your organization, the constructs within your organization, the kinds of data that you deal with, and the flavor of the problems that you're dealing with. We all deal with different kinds of data. And so the spiciness of what you're working with is going to dictate a lot of the headwinds that you're facing. So please forgive me if it sounds like I'm speaking in abstractions, but this pattern is what I've seen work in the past. The first thing I face is making connections, making sure that I'm getting a nice broad reach within the organization, making sure that we can see everything that's going on. So I call it connect. Make sure that we have inroads to all the different parts of the organization. We can see everything. The next one is collect, making sure, okay, great, everyone knows how to reach us and we have the reviews coming in, right? I know this sounds like, operations management 101, but we're getting those pipelines, we're getting these reviews. We have that purview, we're maximizing our oversight. And then finally, we're measuring those things coming in. And that's all the KPIs and saying, okay, great, we're measuring our load, we're measuring the latency and SLAs, we're measuring our review impact. And we're saying, okay, great, we're having an impact. We're identifying vulnerabilities, we're remediating those vulnerabilities, we're doing the right thing, like we talked about with C-suites, right? We have a material impact on this business. And then if it turns out that we need more headcount, we have all the ammunition that we need to argue for it, to say, look, we're falling behind day to day, week to week. We can't keep up with this load. And you've already done all the legwork to maximize that argument. So I know it sounds abstract. I know it sounds like, well, obviously, but that's the road we walk. That's the work.
Great. Thank you for those insights, Alejo. Alon, how about yourself?
I see this as a fairly similar question to the previous one. And I think that the same answer more or less applies, highlighting the monetary risk and the current gaps within the organization and making the kind of a similar case.
Mira, over to you.
This may lead into or may segue into another question, but I think here it's having a technical privacy review process doesn't have to be prohibitively expensive. It doesn't have to be a team of 30 senior staff privacy technologists. I think having a solid, in my experience, having a solid triage process, which can be partially or entirely automated, will, one, help the process scale, but also helps just reduce costs so that in the end, it's really those high risk use cases that are getting technical reviews from senior individuals from more expensive resources rather. I'll lean on Alon and Alejo to speak on to the engineering of the automation piece, but even having in your initial triage process 1 PM that's helping assess, is this high risk, low risk, or having automated JIRA features where you're catching what kind of data is in scope, the level of the sensitivity, does this need a manual review, or can this be sent for auto approval with data deletion, and here are your requirements, or you need to set a retention period and here's how to do it, or you need to tag your data and here's how to do it. Those pieces can be automated, so it doesn't have to be this break the bank situation.
Great point. One thing I'll say to people is that the key is to get started and start showing some benefit. I think the mistake people in privacy sometimes make is, to Mira's point, they think it's going to be a big army, a big team, or a big product, etc. Right? Maybe you can start small and identify people in 3 or 4 critical teams. That's how I became a privacy engineer back in the day when I was at WebMD, where you identify people who routinely care about these things. There's always going to be somebody in the company that cares about this stuff, even though they don't know what privacy means. Identify them, showcase to their boss the work they did and how it affected the business, how it protected us from risk, etc. And once people see the actual benefit happening and somebody getting credit for it, you will have more people helping you out. And then you begin the movement bottom up. Staffing typically happens top down, budget wise, but actual participation happens bottom up, right? So be open to the fact that you may not get the acquiescence you immediately want. And sometimes people go, oh, privacy. And honestly, privacy is important, but so is misinformation, so is security, so is physical safety, so is food quality. A lot of things are important. And the people who have to make the case for privacy budgets also have to make the case for many other things as well. So please don't take it personally and don't piss people off by being overly self-righteous when people push back on budget requests, right? I've been the person that was over self-righteous. I've been pushed back. So learn from my experience, and hopefully you won't have as many gray hair as I do to show for it, right? So that's my insight. Next question from my friend Heather this time. How about engineers using AI assist code writing tools like Copilot? So yes, the use of AI products to do interviews, right? ERDs is all the rage right now. So how do you deal with this extra variable when it comes to assessing risk from a privacy perspective? Alon, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think here it's slightly like walking a tightrope. You don't want to be left behind and not leverage these efficiency enhancing tools as soon as you can. But then in addition, you don't want to go overboard, and you need to make sure that you've instilled some guardrails around its usage to basically make sure that things aren't slightly getting out of hand. So for example, if it's about code writing, maybe you need to make sure that you have SAS tooling or static analysis in place to try and identify gaps. You want to harden your code review process. Make sure that maybe if it's AI assisted code, it needs an additional review. And all of those are basically enforced by the infrastructure, the processes that are in place. Generally, anything that's not hardly enforced, you'll have an engineer that's just going to go ahead and do it. So that would basically kind of be my approach to it. First, you need to assess what the impact of not just AI assisted code, but also any other generative AI usage. Make sure that you assess it clearly, and then place the correct guardrails and start trying it out slowly.
Awesome. You want to go next, Mira? I think I asked Leo. I haven't asked you, Mira, yet. Mira, you haven't gone to that question, right? Yet?
No, I don't think Alejo's gone either. But yeah, I'll speak strictly speaking to technical privacy review process. I think if you're automating a triage process, you're automating a review, an approval process, it's important to have periodic sampling. So you're catching manually false negatives, false positives, and you can use that data to retrain your systems. I think there's always going to be some error in that automation process, and that's why the high risk review should still be manually reviewed by privacy specialists. And so yes, I mean there's risk in using the tooling. So that's why we always want to have that human in the loop element for both enhancing the AI and for being able to continue to scale.
That is great. Alejo?
Yeah, I think I'm in that same camp. I approach these things with some trepidation. I think I personally haven't had a chance to really take Copilot for a spin just yet, not into the depth that I would have liked, but I'd like to keep a human in the loop for a little bit longer. And I think to Mira's point, especially once it starts reaching, I think, the hands of folks like privacy engineers, especially from a perspective of like evaluating code and saying like, okay, what, give me a sense of what's going on here. You tell me, computer, is there danger here? I think we absolutely need to take that with a lot of salt up front until we find that it's trustworthy.
And that is
Sorry,
great.
call me a skeptic.
Yeah. And I think the value of some of these tools has not yet been proven yet. So I'm not sure if people want to be sleeping for them yet. So I understand the skepticism. And I love the nice little scam we have going here where I come to this webinar with like 2 or 3 questions prepared and the audience just does my job for me. So in that spirit, I'll ask the next question. How would you handle something that is poor privacy by design but hard coded? So it's a bad movie, but people are lining up to buy tickets for it. How do you show people the light? Mira, you want to go first?
I generally approach this with the risk question, trying to identify, unpack the risks, and present, here's the possible, the whole platter of possible scenarios, possible outcomes. What level of risk is the business willing to accept given this risk?
Awesome. Alon, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think I'd couple what Mira just said with also providing an assessment of what would an alternative solution look like? How much effort would it take to implement that? And are there ways to maybe not tackling everything at once, but improving on the current situation, at least moving the needle in the right direction?
Great, Alejo?
This is possibly one of my favorite problems to solve as a privacy engineer, because I feel like we sit right between engineering and legal and something else. And so I think how we handle this is to absolutely help reconcile the deep divide between legal pounding the table and saying we will not stand for this, right? This is bad privacy, or this is a risk we're unwilling to take, and product and product management saying, well, we've already printed the brochures, right? This is going live. We have a conference in 2 weeks. This needs to go out the door. And so how we handle this is to apply all of our skills in privacy, understanding the danger and the risk, and all of our skills in engineering to understand how much of this can change and how much of this can't. And so we start by looking at, for example, the privacy impact assessment and the code, and we go to engineering and we say, yes, tell me how this works. Help me understand why is this hard coded? Why is this set up this way? And they tell us, and we go, okay, I understand. And then we go to product management and say, why is this such a hard deadline? Help me understand the business implications. Why is this structured this way? And we say, okay, all right, I understand. And then we go back to legal and say, tell me about these risks. Help me understand. Okay, forgive me, but which law exactly? How is that written? How much wiggle room do we have? Why are you so concerned? What are you worried about? And they say, well, it's a biometrics. And we go, okay, but which part of that exactly, right? Because, is what we have biometrics? Is it? Because what if it's like this? What if we stored it like this? And we're applying our understanding, because now that we have the whole thing in our heads as privacy engineers, we're able to kind of start crafting a solution. And when we can get legal to simmer down a little, and we can go back to the product engineers and the feature engineers and say, all right, check this out. Can you just turn it like this a little bit? Could we do it cheaply? Could you instead of storing the whole user's face, could you just store the face vector? Could you maybe change it like this, or tweak the math so that you're not quite in that biometric space? Or, right, could you anonymize it? Could you pseudonymize it so we can just kind of walk the line? Even k-anonymity. Can you give me k-anonymity? Can we just get out of this problem so that we can still make the deadline and everybody's happy? That's my favorite kind of work. So what a wonderful, beautiful question. Sorry, what a great question. Thank you, anonymous attendee. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would basically identify like what is the worst thing that could happen? What is the worst that could happen if this badly coded
What's the
PPT stuff?
worst that can happen?
How likely is it? So the impact and the likelihood are numbers to start with. Again, bring it back to the numbers, bring it back to the narrative, and see what you can come up with, right? There are no easy answers. It may not work, but your job is to call the risk out and then see what the organization is able to do and make the case, use your judgment, and then I just go with that. That's because this is not the only thing. Right now, we're answering this question one question at a time, but in reality, you'll have multiple judgment calls to make, right? So think of this in that context. Okay, we have about 7 minutes to go. My next question is, how do you collaborate with product teams? So we've talked about getting support from the legal team, from the C-suite, from engineers. How do you bring the product team along with you? Alon, you want to go first?
Yeah, let me think about it for just a second here.
Let me go to Alejo first, and you can gather your thoughts for a second. Alejo, you want to go first?
No, same here. Just a second. I'm catching up on this.
Mira, you want to go next then?
I would see,
Girl,
I will do it
um,
similarly to engineering. Oh, but yeah, please go ahead, Mira.
I have found it really beneficial if you have the resourcing to be able to dedicate one privacy engineer, one privacy specialist to a product team, to an eng team, so you have that partnership, so that the privacy technologist has a deep understanding and is working day to day to understand what's on the product roadmap, working with the engineers, so understanding really the requirements that are coming through from that end, and being able to have conversations in real time in that ideation stage to be able to help influence design and help really build privacy into the design.
That's good. That's a great place to start. And also, like, the product team can be your biggest ally. Identify a product team that's just trying to get off the ground a little bit, or a product team that's well established. That'd be a good place to start as well. But Alon, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think I would also view it in kind of the same fashion as engaging with the engineering groups. Try to show what value can be provided, how the products can be enhanced by kind of having privacy in there by design, how we're making sure that you're doing right by your customers, and kind of frame it in that way. Show the value it would add to the overall product, to user trust, and to their processes.
I would basically say identify teams that care about physical security, that care about compliance, that care about trust and ethics, right? But also identify a product team that makes the company money. You want to identify one, like the moral product team that genuinely cares about the right thing, focuses on the sort of the New York Times test, and then another product team that makes the company a ton of money. You want to have a bit of both. You want to have, just like you want protein and carbs in your diet, you want to have money and morality at the same time on your balance sheet, right? So kind of build your allies gradually, and it'll get better as time. We might have time for one or two questions. Michelle, next. Sometimes there is an issue of trust in the engineering group. Plus, there is a view that there are bad actors. How do you make these judgment calls as to who do you trust, who do you not trust? There are no right or wrong answers. Well, there are always wrong answers, but let's try and see what you guys come up with. Alon, you want to go first?
Let me catch up on that question.
Yeah, it's a question from Michelle from at 11:39 a.m. Eastern.
Oh,
You want to go first,
yeah.
Mira?
I'm trying to
I've caught up on it, I guess.
go ahead, Alan. Yeah.
I honestly don't appreciate kind of that view regarding bad actors. I guess I have many colleagues and friends across the tech industry and many engineering groups, and I feel like it's pervasive that people want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. I don't think there's many people out there that off the bat have the wrong intentions. How do we change that perception? I'm not wholly sure.
You want to take a stab at this, Alejo?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's kind of to Alon's point, like try to avoid labeling people as bad actors if you can. I don't want to like, smack down this question because it's a very good question, but rather remember that everybody has different motivations. So if you feel like you're facing someone and you're like, this person like hates privacy, or this person does not have privacy in their heart, it might be just that they are facing different constraints or different motivations. Like they are motivated by trying to get this feature out the door, or they are facing pressure from a manager or an executive that says, get this going at all costs. Like you are trying to hit a deadline, not trying to hit a privacy feature set. And so you might need to change your approach to try to help them, right, still meet those constraints or change those constraints, right? So I would say my response to this might be to try to seek to understand before being understood so that you can cater your message to what they're up against. I hope that helps.
Yeah. And I would basically say use your judgment and build relationships, right? And educate people. And if there is genuinely a bad actor, if there's somebody who genuinely looks you in the eye and says, I don't care what happens here, that's a different conversation. If people are misjudging the risk, or if people are being overly optimistic, that's a different challenge. So try and suss that out, have conversations with people, reach out to people, skip level boss if possible, talk to your colleagues who have worked well with this other team. But again, optimize for time and optimize for impact, because it's not always going to be possible to make the right judgment call in the moment. And if you make a mistake, don't sweat it too much, because at the end of the day, these things move fast and these impacts change pretty quickly. So I would say make those judgment calls on an ongoing basis. But yeah. But with that being said, we are out of time. We don't have time for another question. So thank you all so much for coming. This has been a great webinar, and I would look to having you guys in a future webinar as well. Please join our community. Hernando will share the link with you guys going forward. But thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it, folks.